Look at a map of Africa, and you'll notice something unusual. Unlike Europe, with its winding borders following rivers and mountain ranges, Africa's borders are dominated by straight lines. In the Sahara, borders run for hundreds of kilometers in perfectly straight lines. In West Africa, borders slice through ethnic homelands, splitting the Yoruba between Nigeria and Benin, the Yu between Ghana and Togo, the Maasai between Kenya and Tanzania. The Somali people find themselves divided across 5 different countries. And here's the thing: these borders don't make sense. They were never designed to. What's up, everyone? Thanks for joining me for another deep dive into African history. This isn't a simple story about evil Europeans drawing bad borders. The reality is far more complex and troubling. What we're exploring is a genuine historical puzzle. How did we end up with borders everyone agrees are problematic? And why has it proven impossible to change them despite decades of conflict? Traced directly back to these arbitrary lines? Pre-colonial Africa was a complex, dynamic political landscape featuring empires, kingdoms, city-states, and decentralized societies. In West Africa, empires like Mali and Songhai controlled vast territories with fluid, constantly shifting boundaries. The Ethiopian Empire had existed for centuries, with borders that expanded and contracted. The Kingdom of Congo and Zulu Kingdom wielded power in southern Africa. East African city-states like Kilwa and Mombasa controlled hinterlands of varying sizes. But here's what's crucial. These formations didn't operate with fixed, linear borders like modern nation-states. Sovereignty was graduated, core territories under direct control, zones of tribute where local rulers maintained autonomy, and frontier regions where authority was contested. When the Mali Empire was at its height, you couldn't have drawn a precise line showing where Mali ended. Political authority radiated outward from centers and weakened the farther you got. Ethnic groups were similarly complex. The Yoruba had various kingdoms, Oyo, Ife, Ijebu, that sometimes cooperated, sometimes fought. The Somali organized into clan families with no centralized state tradition. The Igbo lived in largely decentralized communities without kings. This diversity undermines the idea of natural borders aligning with pre-existing units. The challenge of organizing diverse peoples into political units always existed. What changed was who controlled that organization. So anyway, let's talk about how we got from that complex pre-colonial landscape to the straight-line borders we see today. And that means we need to talk about the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, although we need to be careful not to overstate what actually happened there. The Berlin Conference was convened by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck and brought together representatives from 14 European nations, plus the United States, to establish ground rules for European claims to African territory. Notice I said ground rules. The conference didn't actually divide up Africa. That's a common misconception. What it did was establish the principle of effective occupation, meaning European powers had to demonstrate actual presence and administration in territories they claimed, not just plant a flag and call it theirs. But here's what the conference set in motion. It accelerated the scramble for Africa dramatically. In 1880, only about 10% of Africa was under European control, mostly coastal areas. By 1914, that figure was over 90%. Ethiopia and Liberia were the only independent states remaining. What happened in between was a frantic rush by European powers to claim as much territory as possible. And this is where those bizarre borders got drawn. The actual border drawing process was haphazard in the extreme. European powers would negotiate with each other in Paris, London, or Berlin, often with extraordinarily limited knowledge of the geography they were dividing up. Rivers that looked substantial on maps might be seasonal streams that dried up for half the year. Mountain ranges that seemed like natural boundaries might not actually exist where the maps showed them. And ethnic distributions? Forget it. The men drawing these lines had virtually no understanding of who lived where or how different groups related to each other. Let me give you a specific example. When Britain and France were negotiating the border between their territories in West Africa, they drew a line that cut straight through the middle of Yoruba-speaking peoples, splitting them between what would become Nigeria and Benin. Same thing happened with the Yu people, divided between Gold Coast, now Ghana, and Togoland. The Maasai found themselves split between British Kenya and German Tanganyika. The Somali people got the worst of it, divided across Italian Somaliland, British Somaliland, French Somaliland, British Kenya, and Ethiopian Territory. 5 different colonial jurisdictions for one ethnic group. And it wasn't just about splitting ethnic groups. Sometimes borders were drawn right through the middle of kingdoms and political units that had existed for centuries. The Kingdom of Congo was partitioned between Portuguese Angola, French Congo, and Belgian Congo. The Sokoto Caliphate was divided between British Nigeria and French territories to the north. Ancient trade routes were severed. Economic networks that had existed for generations were disrupted. But here's the thing, and this is important. It's not that Europeans drew these borders maliciously to divide and conquer, though that interpretation exists. The reality is often more banal and therefore more troubling. In many cases, they just didn't care. The borders were drawn to settle disputes between European powers, not to create functional administrative units. They were designed to prevent European countries from going to war with each other over African territory, not to create viable states for African people. In the 1950s and 60s, African countries gained independence and faced an immediate question. What about these borders? Some leaders proposed redrawing them, Pan-African federations, radically redrawn maps. But in July 1964, the Organization of African Unity met in Cairo and declared that all member states would respect borders existing at independence. This principle, uti possidetis juris, made colonial borders permanent. The logic was pragmatic. First, almost every border was wrong somehow. Opening revision risked continent-wide conflict. Second, independence movements organized around colonial territories. Third, fear of domino effects. One successful redrawing could encourage endless separatist movements. Fourth, no consensus on what better borders looked like. Ethnic identities were complex and overlapping, linguistic boundaries fuzzy. The OAU chose stability over justice, a calculated gamble that peace required accepting historical injustice. The OAU allowed border changes under one condition, both parties agreeing through peaceful, democratic means. Eritrea is the most successful example, yet it came at extraordinary cost. Eritrea was annexed by Ethiopia in 1962, sparking a 30-year independence war. The Eritrean People's Liberation Front fought successive Ethiopian governments. By 1991, they'd won. In 1993, 99% voted for independence. It seemed like a model for peaceful border changes. But that 30-year war killed hundreds of thousands, perhaps up to 1 million. And the border wasn't clearly defined because colonial-era treaties between Italy and Ethiopia were vague. 5 years later, Eritrea and Ethiopia went to war again over Badme village. Over 500,000 troops involved, the world's largest war then. Between 70 and 300,000 died. 600,000 displaced. Think about that. Eritrea fought 30 years for independence. They won, held a referendum, gained recognition. Within 5 years, they were at war over exactly where those borders should be. A permanent court ruled in 2005, but Ethiopia refused to accept it. Tensions remained until 2018. Over 50 years of conflict. To establish a border maybe 50 kilometers different from expectations. Even with the right process, the details can kill thousands. South Sudan achieved independence through armed struggle and referendum. 2 Sudanese civil wars spanning decades killed 2 million. Wars fought along ethnic and religious lines. The 2005 peace agreement promised a referendum. In January 2011, 99% voted for independence. South Sudan became the world's newest country. By December 2013, barely 2 years later, civil war erupted. President Kiir and Vice President Machar's power struggle took on ethnic dimensions. Kiir's Dinka fighting Machar's Nuer. Nearly 400,000 died. 4 million displaced, over a third of the population. And crucially, the violence wasn't about the international border. It was about internal borders, ethnic territorial control, resources, power. Despite a 2018 peace agreement, fighting continues. South Sudan ranks among the poorest countries despite oil reserves. The lesson: creating a new country doesn't solve fundamental problems. Ethnic tensions, resource competition, weak institutions, all reproduced within new borders. The attempted Biafran secession shows what happens when border changes lack international support. Nigeria in the 1960s was fragile. The British had cobbled together the Hausa Fulani North, Yoruba Southwest, and Igbo Southeast. In 1966, ethnic violence killed thousands of Igbo in the north. Perhaps 1 million fled southeast. On May 30, 1967, Colonel Ojukwu declared the eastern region independent as Biafra. The federal government launched military campaigns. The Nigerian military blockaded Biafra. Images of starving Biafran children shocked the world. But sympathy didn't translate to recognition. Only 4 countries officially recognized Biafra. The OAU refused, citing the Cairo Declaration. If Biafra succeeded, every separatist movement would be emboldened. The war ended January 1970 when Biafra surrendered. Death toll estimates range from 500,000 to 3 million, mostly from starvation. What's crucial: Biafra's secession failed because the international community refused to legitimize it. The principle of maintaining colonial borders proved stronger than self-determination. Today, Biafran separatist movements still exist. Over 50 years later, borders remain unchanged. So we've looked at cases where borders were successfully changed: Eritrea, South Sudan, and cases where attempts failed: Biafra. But what about the vast majority of African borders that haven't changed at all, despite being equally problematic? What are the costs of maintaining these illogical boundaries? Those costs are enormous and ongoing. Consider the Somali people, divided across Somalia, Djibouti, Kenya, Ethiopia, and historically parts of what's now Somaliland. Somali nationalism has been a source of regional conflict for decades. Somalia invaded Ethiopia in 1977, trying to reclaim the Ogaden region, where ethnic Somalis lived. That war killed tens of thousands. Somalia has experienced state collapse, civil war, famine, and the rise of groups like Al-Shabaab, all related in complex ways to questions of national identity and territorial control. Or think about the Tuareg people, spread across Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Algeria, and Libya. Tuareg rebellions seeking autonomy or independence have erupted repeatedly. In Mali, in the 1960s, 1990s, 2006, and 2012. In Niger, Tuareg rebels fought the government in the 1990s and 2000s. These conflicts have killed thousands and displaced hundreds of thousands. They've contributed to state weakness that has allowed jihadist groups to gain footholds in the Sahel. The Kurds in the Middle East get a lot of attention for being a stateless people divided by borders, but Africa has dozens of such groups. The Oromo in Ethiopia, the Lunda between Congo and Angola, the Ankole between Uganda and Rwanda. The list goes on and on. Each of these splits creates political tensions, complicates governance, and can become sources of conflict. But it's not just about ethnic groups split by borders. It's also about the economic irrationality of many borders. Countries that could benefit from economic integration are separated by boundaries that make trade difficult. Landlocked countries, and Africa has 16 of them, more than any other continent, have to negotiate access to ports through their neighbors, creating dependencies and political complications. Resources like rivers, mineral deposits, and oil fields that cross borders create disputes over ownership and revenue sharing. And then there's the simple problem of border security and control. Many African borders run through remote, difficult terrain. Governments lack the resources to patrol them effectively. This creates opportunities for smuggling, trafficking, and the movement of armed groups. The borders between Nigeria and its neighbors are porous, allowing Boko Haram to operate across national boundaries. The borders in the Sahel are similarly difficult to control, enabling jihadist groups and criminal networks to move freely. All of this, the ethnic tensions, the economic inefficiencies, the security challenges, can be traced back to those arbitrary colonial borders. And yet, despite all these problems, the borders remain. So we come to the heart of the question: if these borders cause so many problems, why can't they be changed? We've talked about the OAU's decision to maintain them, but that was over 60 years ago. Why hasn't that consensus shifted? The answer is that the same factors that led to the Cairo Declaration in 1964 remain relevant today, and in some ways, they've become even stronger. Let me walk through the main reasons. First, there's the simple fact that no one can agree on what better borders would look like. Should we have a Yoruba state combining parts of Nigeria and Benin? Okay, but the Yoruba aren't politically unified. Different Yoruba subgroups have different interests and histories. Should we unite the Somali people in one country? Somalia tried that with the Ogaden War and failed. And what about all the non-Somali people living in those territories? Do they get a say? Every proposal for redrawing borders creates as many problems as it solves. Uniting one group inevitably means dividing another. Creating a new border means creating new minorities. And who decides? A referendum? But which populations get to vote? The ethnic group in question? But ethnic identity is often contested. People have multiple, overlapping identities. All the citizens in the affected territory. But then you're asking some people to vote themselves out of a country they consider their own. Second, there's the issue of resources. Many border disputes are really about control over valuable resources. The Abyei region between Sudan and South Sudan has oil. The dispute there isn't just about ethnic belonging, it's about who gets the oil revenue. The Bakassi Peninsula between Nigeria and Cameroon had fishing rights and potential oil deposits. When the International Court of Justice ruled in Cameroon's favor in 2002, Nigeria took years to actually hand over the territory because of the economic stakes involved. If you start allowing border changes based on economic arguments, you open a Pandora's box. Richer regions would want to separate from poorer ones. Oil-producing areas would seek independence. Port cities would try to become city-states. The result would be massive fragmentation and endless conflict over resources. Third, the international system itself discourages border changes. The United Nations operates on the principle of state sovereignty and territorial integrity. The African Union's Constitutive Act, which replaced the OAU Charter in 2002, explicitly reaffirms respect for borders. International law recognizes only very limited circumstances under which new states can emerge, usually involving severe human rights abuses or complete state failure. This creates a self-reinforcing system. Because border changes are discouraged internationally, countries don't want to set precedents that could be used against them. Even countries that might benefit from supporting someone else's border claim won't do it because they fear creating a precedent that could justify changes to their own borders. Fourth, and this is perhaps most important, the political and economic structures of modern African states are now deeply embedded in the existing borders. Governments, armies, businesses, trade routes, infrastructure, all of this has been built within and around current borders. Changing borders would mean redistributing power, wealth, and resources in ways that would create massive resistance from those who benefit from the current system. Think about it. If you're part of the political elite in Kenya, you have no interest in the Maasai areas joining with Tanzania to form a Maasai state, even if that might make sense ethnically or culturally. That would mean losing territory, losing tax revenue, losing political power. The same logic applies across the continent. The people who have the power to change borders are precisely the people who benefit most from maintaining them. So if we can't change the borders, what can be done? Are we just stuck with this colonial legacy forever? Well, not necessarily. There are alternative approaches that countries have tried, or could try, that might address some of the problems without the catastrophic risks of redrawing borders. One approach is federalism or decentralization. Instead of trying to separate along ethnic lines, you devolve power to regions within existing borders. Ethiopia has tried this with its ethnic federalism system, giving significant autonomy to regions defined by ethnicity. It's had mixed results. It's prevented some conflicts, but exacerbated others. And Ethiopia recently experienced a devastating civil war in Tigray that showed the limits of ethnic federalism. Nigeria has a federal system that gives states significant power. Kenya has devolved power to counties. South Africa has provinces with their own governments. The idea is that if people feel represented at the local level, they're less likely to seek secession or to fight over who controls the national government. But decentralization brings its own problems. It can entrench local elites, create new levels of corruption, and sometimes just moves conflict from the national to the local level. Another approach is economic integration that makes borders less relevant. The East African community is working toward free movement of people and goods across Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi. ECOWAS in West Africa has similar goals. The idea is that if you can live, work, and trade across borders, then the borders matter less. You might be Uwe in Ghana, but if you can freely cross into Togo to visit family and do business, the division is less painful. The African Continental Free Trade Area, launched in 2019, aims to create a single market across the entire continent. If successful, this could be transformative, but implementation faces enormous challenges: corruption, infrastructure deficits, lack of trust between governments, protection of local industries. We're decades away from seeing whether this approach can really work. A third approach is conflict resolution and power-sharing agreements that accommodate multiple groups within existing borders. Consociational democracy, where different ethnic or religious groups get guaranteed representation and power is shared, has been tried in various forms. It's helped stabilize some situations, but it can also freeze ethnic divisions and make cross-ethnic political cooperation harder. There's also been some success with cross-border cooperation agreements that allow ethnic groups to maintain connections across borders. Some countries have allowed dual citizenship or special border crossing arrangements for people whose communities are split. These are modest measures, but they can reduce tensions. Looking forward, technology might offer some new possibilities. Better communication and transportation could make it easier for communities to stay connected across borders. Digital governance could allow for more flexible, overlapping jurisdictions. But these are still mostly theoretical. We don't have good examples yet of how this might work in practice. What we do know is that the status quo is unsustainable in many places. The tensions created by arbitrary borders continue to fuel conflict, undermine governance, and hold back development. But we also know that attempting to redraw borders has, in most cases, led to even worse outcomes. We're stuck between two bad options, searching for a third way that might not exist. 60 years after the Cairo Declaration, the debate about African borders is as alive as it's ever been. In some ways, borders have become even more entrenched. States have had decades to build institutions and identities around them. A Kenyan national identity is stronger now than it was in 1963. A Nigerian identity exists in ways it didn't after independence. But in other ways, the problems are getting worse. Climate change is intensifying competition over resources, especially water and arable land, making border disputes more volatile. The rise of jihadist groups in the Sahel has shown how porous borders can enable instability to spread across entire regions. Migration pressures are increasing, with people moving across borders in search of economic opportunity or fleeing conflict, creating new tensions. And there are still active separatist movements across the continent. Southern Cameroonians seeking independence for the Anglophone regions, the Cabinda Enclave in Angola, Western Sahara's disputed status, Somaliland, which has functioned as a de facto independent state since 1991 but lacks international recognition. Each of these represents a potential flashpoint where the tension between the principle of maintaining borders and the principle of self-determination could erupt. The international community's position remains contradictory. On one hand, there's strong support for territorial integrity and maintaining existing borders. On the other hand, there's rhetoric about self-determination and human rights that sometimes seems to suggest people should be able to choose their own governance. This contradiction was on full display in South Sudan, where the international community supported independence despite the general presumption against border changes. So where does that leave us? Understanding that African borders are simultaneously illogical and unchangeable helps us navigate the complexity of contemporary African politics. When we see conflict in the Sahel, or instability in the Great Lakes region, or separatist movements in West Africa, we can understand these as partly the ongoing legacy of colonial border drawing. But we also need to recognize that there are no easy solutions, no simple map changes that would fix everything. The borders that make no sense are borders we're stuck with. That doesn't mean accepting the injustices they create, but it does mean being realistic about what's possible. It means focusing on governance, on power sharing, on economic development, on regional integration, all the unglamorous work of building functional states within imperfect boundaries. It means acknowledging that the nation-state model itself, with its assumption of defined territories and unified populations, might not fit African realities as well as we've pretended. And maybe most importantly, it means recognizing that the question of African borders isn't really about borders at all. It's about power, resources, identity, and belonging. It's about who gets to decide how people live together, who benefits from political arrangements, who controls resources. The lines on maps are just where these deeper struggles get projected. All in all, the paradox of African borders, illogical yet unchangeable, reflects the fundamental challenge of building new political communities from the wreckage of colonial rule. Europe spent centuries fighting bloody wars to establish its borders. Asia's borders were often drawn through similar conflicts. Africa was told to accept borders drawn by foreigners and make them work within a few decades. That it's been as successful as it has been is remarkable. That tensions remain should surprise no one. So what do you think? Is there a path forward that I haven't considered? Are there examples of countries successfully managing these tensions that we could learn from? How do we balance the principle of self-determination with the practical need for stable borders? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely interested in hearing different perspectives on this, especially from those of you who have direct experience with these issues. Anyway, that's what I've got for you all today. If this kind of rigorous historical analysis connected to contemporary issues is your thing, you know what to do. And for those of you supporting the channel, you make this kind of deep dive research possible, so thank you. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and keep questioning the narratives we're given. Peace.